You posed a lot of questions there. One I took is the institutional framework of the UNHCR actually induces protracted refugee situations, contributes to the persistence of the situation. And James, would you like to say something?
I'll take a stab at that. Gaki, the point that you make about refugee situations as being big business and how to understand the political economy of these situations is hugely important. In the edited volume, we have a chapter by Jeff Crisp and Amy Slaughter. Jeff Crisp is the senior policy advisor for the High Commissioner for Refugees. And in this chapter, he talks about UNHCR as becoming a surrogate state, that UNHCR has played a significant role in allowing these situations to become protracted because they've been tempted by this idea of accepting large budgets from donor governments to go in, set up these infrastructures in camps that essentially run for a very long time and are not focused on trying to find solutions. And this is why I think this December, when UNHCR came out with a position paper that said we've been focused for 15 years on this objective of providing care, assistance, and maintenance in camps, to say that maybe that was a mistake. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. Maybe we should be focusing much more on encouraging self-reliance. This is a huge breakthrough that I think that we've made, and it creates a great opportunity for more research, more of an evidence base to be able to go in and say what are the alternatives and what they would look like. And the flip side of that is a lot of countries that host refugees for a very long time, like Kenya, Tanzania, like Thailand, there's this rhetoric that the prolonged presence of refugees is a burden and is a security concern. But actually, when you visit refugee-populated areas, these are sites of great ingenuity and innovation. Even with these restrictions placed on refugee movements, you find great sources of enterprise that spring up in camps and around camps. The prolonged presence of refugee programs creates employment, creates spin-off benefits for local population. The population of Dadaab over the course of the camps there has gone up from somewhere like 1,000, 1,500 to over 15,000, 20,000 people living around Dadaab because they come looking for jobs. So part of my argument would be, let's look more critically at the political economy of these refugee-populated areas. In what instances are there burdens that are associated with the prolonged presence of refugees on the environment, on infrastructure, on all these kinds of concerns? How can we mitigate those? How can we use development assistance to mitigate those burdens? But where are there benefits in terms of employment, in terms of agricultural production if refugees are allowed to work outside of the camps? How can we have a more informed discussion about the opportunities that can lead to solutions? And this goes back to Derek's point before. UNHCR had a working paper that came out, I think, about 3 months ago that talked about these informal instances of local integration and refugees who have found ways to cope. There's huge potential that's locked up in these camps. And if we can engage these individuals and these economies as part of a solution, I think we're going to make a very important step forward. So that only answers the first part of your question, but I wanted to make that point.
Let me just add a few things to James about that and then answer the question about coercion. On his last point, one of the things we learned in the Dadaab camp when we lived there and did research in it, the 15% of the refugees of the camp were not refugees from Somalia, but were Somali Kenyans who came into the camp to live in the camp because the opportunities were better in the camp than outside. And that creates one of the variations and the dilemmas. The other thing is I want to say about that first question is, let me, for a change, be a defender of UNHCR. And it's not my usual role. But UNHCR is stuck with certain kinds of limitations. Part of it is the way it gets its funding on an annual basis that limits what it can and cannot do. And so it often doesn't have the funds to help people get home when in fact they want to go home and they should go home, and it costs more to get them home than to keep them in the camps, quite a bit more. So there are a complexity of kinds of situations that you have to disaggregate, and the institutional roles that reinforce certain things and alleviate things. And I don't think it's simply a choice of, here's the good solution and here's the bad solution. but you're always faced with it, which is the least worst one, because they're all bad in these situations, and you want to do what is the worst. And you're often very limited in the choices you can make. On the question of coercion, you're very right to refer to the situation back in the Congo, and we document in our book that, this is another book, but that the situation was when the 1,500,000 or so walked home and did it over 3 days, they were healthy, contrary to all the publicity that had been going out about these dying of dysentery and weak and starving, etc. And there were two different things that came out of it. One is that a lot of the NGO information was absolutely false, and particularly on the numbers. So when we did our studies of numbers, we found, in fact, the alleged genocide that occurred in the Zaire, or the DRC as it became, didn't exist because the numbers originally had been grossly inflated by the control of the camps and the numbers in the camps. So that there's that kind of a problem. As the role, as far as the role of Rwanda in that case, we found that Rwanda was intent and developed its intentions much more politically and much more ambitiously, was to get rid of the Hutu extremists who controlled the camps, which they did, and that's why the people walked home. And that wasn't a coercive return. That was a removal of coercion to allow them to return. On the other hand, the 500,000 that returned from Tanzania, who has an excellent record in refugee settlement and just taking a whole bunch of Burundians now, in fact, coerced the 500,000 to return in that case, and UNHCR in that case went along with it. So you have to look into each picture and what happens and why it happens, and it has different reasons and different contexts. And coercion takes place in a lot of the situations, that people move back and forth because of coercive operations by different countries, and sometimes UNHCR says, well, if we don't go along with it, they're going to starve on the way home, so we're going to have to cooperate and see that they're fed on the way home, and they're faced with that kind of situation and therefore become complicit in a coercive return operation.